Welcome, welcome all. So glad that you could join us today for the NMRC webinar. We're joined by Dr. Tim Cavell. He'll be sharing with us today on involving peers in the mentoring relationship. We'll get started momentarily. Please pop in the chat where you are joining us from today. Alamosa, welcome. I'm from Colorado also. Always glad to see a fellow Coloradan in the room. London.
Is that the UK?
That's right. Unless that's like a London somewhere in like Kansas that I just don't know about.
There's Ontario, London, Ontario.
Ooh, that's true.
London, UK, Carolina. In the house.
Sacramento, Grand Rapids, another Coloradan. Welcome, Michelle. Folks from Washington and Maine, big brothers, big sisters. Glad you all could be here. Well, while we are still waiting for folks to roll in, I know that it is lunchtime in some parts of the world where folks are joining. We'll give them a few minutes to join on. But I'll just start with some logistics at the top. Welcome, everybody. Again, thank you so much for joining us today for the NMRC webinar involving peers and mentoring activities. My name is Rachel Bennett. I'm the research manager at Mentor. I'm joined by my wonderful colleagues, Dr. Kelly Stewart and Hannah Bergman from the University of Illinois, Chicago, who will be helping with logistics on our call today. Today we'll hear from Dr. Tim Cavell. But before we turn it over to Tim, a few logistical pieces for you all. During our webinar, please post any questions that you have in the Q&A. You can find that little icon in the bottom of your screen. Just be labeled Q&A. You can pull that up and post any questions you have there throughout the webinar. We'll have time at the end for questions, but we'll address your questions throughout as well. Everyone will get a copy of Dr. Cavell's lovely slides following the presentation today, and we'll have a recording made available through the NMRC website, so you can share the great information you get today with any colleagues that are not able to join us. That'll be available at nationalmentoringresourcecenter.org. So now I'll introduce you all to Dr. Tim Cavell. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce him. Dr. Tim Cavell is a professor of psychological science at the University of Arkansas, and of course, a member of the NMRC's research board. He is a clinical and child family psychologist by trade and a prevention researcher. His work, and it's a lot, has included lots of school-based work, especially projects to support children with aggressive behaviors, at risk for later substance use, support for children in military families, mentoring for chronically bullied children, as well as natural mentoring supports for adolescents exposed to dating violence, and support for parents to help them promote safe and informal relationships for their children. So as you all know, you signed up for the webinar today. Today, Dr. Cavell will talk with us about involving how mentors and community and school-based programs can influence the peer networks of the young people that they're mentoring. We'll explore the potential of this, some pitfalls to keep in mind, and Dr. Cavell will share some insights with all of us about when and how and why programs might want to implement that type of approach in their services. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Cavell. Please take it away.
Hey, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. And so I'm looking forward to sharing some information with you and also getting some feedback from you. In fact, I'd like to begin with a question. I'm assuming that, of course, all of you have gone through adolescence. You've gone through those developmental periods, and some of you may be parents. Many of you may have mentored before, so you may have observed this phenomenon whereby children and adolescents tend to behave in ways that are similar to their friends and closest peers, kind of a birds of a feather flock together phenomenon. And research certainly attests to that. In fact, one of the better predictors of youth problem behavior is the extent to which youth affiliate with problem-involved peers. Now, my question is, it seems like a silly question, but it's not, is how do you explain that? How do you explain that the extent to which youth affiliate with deviant peers predicts their own later problem behavior? And I'd ask you to put in the chat your guesses to that, your speculations about what explains that. I'll wait. Feeling of acceptance? Peer pressure? Peer influence? Social norms? These are great answers. Understanding this is a social norm? Okay, yeah. Wanting to belong? Okay. Very good. Thank you. So let me narrow the options a bit. Impulse control, yeah, perhaps. What if I said, is this relation between associating with problem-involved peers and your own level of problem behavior a result of you being influenced as a young person by your peers, or is it that you find peers who are interested in doing what you do and you all have the same interest in problem-seeking behavior? Is it influence or is it selection? Guesses about that? Chris Ward said both. Chris is pretty sharp there. So the research on this definitely points to both processes working. And it's important to recognize that it's both processes, because we tend to think about the peer influence, the peer pressure process, but we tend to think less about the peer selection process. And so the talk I'm going to give today speaks to some of this phenomenon. So with that as a sort of a preface, let's begin with my slide deck. Involving peers in mentoring activities. So we need to go back to go forward. The modern history of youth mentoring is essentially the history of Big Brothers Big Sisters, because that predominated and continues to predominate. And as many of you know, it started as a form of charity in 1904. A judge working with delinquent youth had the notion that a positive adult role model for youth who lacked one would be a good thing. And subsequent to that charitable initiative, there's been some sort of research-driven post hoc theorizing about why would mentoring be helpful. Amy Werner's research on the children of Kauai showed that resilient youth who were coming from difficult circumstances, the resilient subgroup in that sample were those who had at least one supportive adult in their life, which sounds a lot like what mentoring is. So mentoring moved along for decades until there was an effort to ask the question, well, is it working? Does it actually benefit youth? And in 1995, what is known as the impact study was conducted. And the term impact was used because the study was actually more one of an economical question. Is the impact, the economic impact or the benefit of mentoring, does it pay off? Is it worth worth it to put money into mentoring. And if you read those studies closely, you'll see that the effort was not so much to test whether mentoring works or how it works or why it works, but to prove that it works. Okay. So if you hear me saying that that study was done in a bit of a biased way, I think the answer is very true. But the findings that were put forth had a huge impact. So the impact study had an impact itself. 46% of mentored youth less likely to start using drugs, 27% less likely to start using alcohol, 33% less likely to hit someone. I'm assuming that all of you have seen these stats before. They have been repeated ad nauseum. However, ignored was the fact that 44 tests of effects were there were, first of all, there were 44 tests of effects, okay? And they found 3 that were significant. And they used an uncorrected p-value, which means they not 1 in 5 in 100, but 1 in 100. Excuse me, 10 out of 100. So a p less than 0.10 as opposed to p less than 0.05. So they relaxed the criterion by which they judged what was significant, okay? Nevertheless, these findings were a boon to the mentoring industry, to the mentoring initiative, to the movement, and it led to increased funding and rapid expansion of mentoring in the U.S. To the point that in the years 1999 to 2006, Big Brothers Big Sisters quadrupled its school-based mentoring programs, and that's where growth happened most quickly, because you could gear up a school-based mentoring program pretty rapidly if you used because you had sort of a catchment area. You had kids in schools, and if you don't know it, school-based mentoring, especially as it's done typically by Big Brothers Big Sisters, is not a match, as I understand it, that's parent initiated. Instead, it's usually one in which there's a partnership between a mentoring agency and a school, and the school lets parents know that there's this opportunity for their child to be mentored, and do you want to opt in? Well, the other thing that makes it a way to rapidly upscale is that if you use high schoolers as mentors, you can move even more quickly to grow the amount of school-based mentoring. Okay. And that's part of what happened. All right. So then there were more questions that arose when there was more science done. Bernstein et al. Did a huge study of this federally funded program called the School Mentoring Program, the SMP. Unfortunately, they found no benefits for mentoring across 17 different outcomes. So therefore, funding was cut by the Obama administration. Okay. And then there was an evaluation of Big Brothers Big Sisters school-based mentoring program around the same time, and 1,100 youth found similarly disappointing results. 31 outcomes tested, only 3 statistically significant effects. And across all the outcomes, the average effect size was quite small. So this is beginning to be worrisome. Okay. Next slide. And so if you add it up across the years, you've got what I would suggest is 50 years of modest effects from meta-analytic studies. And you see those listed there. Now, these are not insignificant effect sizes, but they're modest. Okay. So it's fair to say there's impact happening, but there's room to improve. Okay. Next slide. So it can be suggested and has been suggested that mentoring was at a crossroads. I think we're kind of still there. This is a quote from Wheeler et al. Arguments seemingly could be made for or against continued investment in school-based mentoring as a strategy for promoting resilience among at-risk youth. Okay, and then our friend Gene Rhodes, overall youth mentoring programs are not nearly as effective as most people assume, particularly when compared to other interventions with youth. Findings from large-scale randomized controlled trials, meta-analyses, and recent cost-benefit studies present a disappointing bottom line with relatively weak effects that have not budged in decades. Next slide. So my colleagues, Renee Spencer and Sam McQuillan and I wrote a paper a few years ago called Back to the Future, Mentoring as Means and End in Promoting Child Mental Health. And in this paper, we offered a new way to frame the work of youth mentoring, encompassing both mentoring as a relationship and mentoring as a context. Okay, so the mentoring as a relationship means that mentoring is an end unto itself, that the goal is to provide the child, the young person, with a supportive relationship. And if anything else happens of benefit to the youth beyond that, that's great, but that's not the goal. However, mentoring is also at times viewed as a means, a vehicle for producing certain outcomes. And so there's been this ongoing debate about which is it, and we suggest it's both. But it's important and incumbent upon programs to articulate which of those two things they're doing. So I need to tell you about the fact that most of my career was based on a mistake in my effort to create a fake mentoring program. All right. So I was working with a colleague, and we had funding from the federal government, and we needed a control condition. We had an experimental condition, but we needed a control condition because we were randomly assigning children to either the control or the experimental condition. Okay. Next slide. So the experimental condition we called Prime Time. It was a multi-component intervention, 3 semesters of community-based mentoring with highly trained, closely supervised mentors. These mentors took a 3-credit college course to learn about how to be a mentor. It's one of the most involved mentoring trainings that you can ever imagine. They had role play, a lot of training. They spent an entire semester being trained. Okay. And we also provided these kids in the program with 3 semesters of supportive consultation with their teachers at school, 3 semesters of supportive consultation with their parent at home, 2 semesters of social problem solving skills training in small groups for the children at school. And there was case manager oversight of all these things. So a lot happening in this experimental condition, but schools were not comfortable with having a no treatment control condition. So we had to provide something. And so what we did was we said, well, let's water down mentoring. Let's make it a fake or faux mentoring program. And this is how we did it. It's based, by the way, on the notion, one that draws right from Gene Rhodes' theory, that mentoring only benefits youth by virtue of the relationship with the mentor. The stronger the relationship, the better outcomes. If the relationship is weak or shortened, not great outcomes. So again, 3 semesters of school-based mentoring, same length as the other condition. However, the mentors were minimally trained. We educated them about school rules, how to dress, follow the lunchtime rules, and just how to, and we gave them a 1-page sheet on how to have a good relationship. All the visits happened in the school cafeteria, and we required mentors to sit at the lunch table with their mentee and their lunch mates, because we wanted, again, to water down the relationship. And children were matched each semester across the 3 semesters with a new mentor. So you can see where this was an intentional effort to dilute the strength of the relationship, to weaken it. Okay. Now, common to both was that both spanned 3 academic semesters. All the mentors were college students enrolled in a course, which helps because mentors had an incentive to stay involved and not drop out. So we virtually eliminated early termination. So this was a study that was done to help do some prevention work with kids identified as aggressive, highly aggressive, based on reports from teachers and peers. So teachers were first asked to nominate kids who fit that description, starts fights, picks on others, etc. Then we had these identified criteria by which to include kids. Our sample was tri-ethnic, white, Black, Hispanic, and you see our measures there that were conducted pre-treatment, post-treatment, and 1-year follow-up. So here are some of the outcomes. As expected, kids in the prime time or experimental condition rated their mentor as more supportive than kids in the lunch buddy condition. That's as expected. So our efforts to weaken the mentoring relationship worked. However, Both groups improved immediately after mentoring. At follow-up 1 year later, we found significant effects for Lunch Buddy outperforming the experimental condition. All the significant effects favored Lunch Buddy mentoring. Okay, so we found that kids with pair with a Lunch Buddy mentor had better teacher-student relationships, higher school engagement and school belonging, and Lunch Buddy was also more effective than prime time for children in high adversity schools. High adversity schools were schools that had more playground aggression, more school mobility, and a higher percentage of kids with free and reduced lunch. So we asked our Lunch Buddy mentors to complete a term paper after their semester to write about their experience being a mentor to a child in the Lunch Buddy program. And here is evidence from that the mentoring could be challenging in that setting. And this is a paper done with my colleague Julia Price. It's a qualitative study. So a mentor noted that the largest obstacles that I had to overcome to get closer to my mentee were the other children. They were all very talkative, outgoing kids. They would fight for my attention from the moment I walked in the door. It took a while for me to ask my mentee a question and actually get an answer from her and not all of the other children. Now, if you're a researcher and you're hearing this, and we did hear our Lunch Buddy mentors complain about how challenging it was to form that one-on-one relationship at the lunch table. But in our mind, we're thinking, well, that's great because this is a controlled condition. It's not supposed to have any benefit. Next slide. But we found also evidence for unanticipated processes. A mentor wrote, some occasions there were kids who would ask me if I was his friend or parent. One time a student asked, why did I want to sit with him? Each time I responded that he was my friend, and I thought it was pretty cool that I got to sit with him. The students who asked would look like they were shocked, and then they'd begin to sit next to us on every visit. It was amazing how their little attitudes or thoughts towards my mentee changed by me saying I was his friend and I like sitting with him. I think there's one more. I made sure that while a majority of my conversations were solely focused on my little girl, I included the other children in the conversations we were having. At first, I noticed each of the girls at the table tried to outtalk one another in attempts to get my attention. Slowly but surely, however, the girls and my mentee started taking turns to say what they needed to say. Although they still sometimes interrupted one another, they improved greatly. Okay, so all that to say is that we found evidence for a program that involved peers having better benefits than a one-on-one mentoring program that was supported by these other components like supportive consultation for parents and teachers and problem-solving skills training for kids. So this standalone Lunch Buddy watered down mentoring program embedded at the lunch table outperformed a community-based program with other supports. So we were puzzled, okay? And we have since come to realize that when you put a mentor at the lunch table, you're having the possibility of affecting a pretty important context for children's social development. In fact, we've got studies showing that what happens at the lunch table is often predictive downstream later in the semester of the academic year. Children, for example, who have lower acceptance at the lunch table by peers or more bullied by the end of the year. Okay, you can think of it this way. In the US, we have the National School Lunch Program, okay, which means that schools often have large cafeterias where kids go and eat. Not always, not everywhere, but that's pretty common. And if you're feeding a lot of kids in a short amount of time, then you want it to be orderly, and there are policies that govern lunchtime seating. And so kids are not always free to sit wherever they want, particularly at the elementary school grades. And so if you're a child, you might likely be sitting next to a classmate who is not your best friend, not your preferred playmate. And so now you've got this social task of trying to interact in some sort of productive, convivial way with children who may not be your closest friends. Some children can pull that off at the lunch table and others struggle with it. Point being, it's an important social task. Okay, so now I'm going to pivot here. And this next slide speaks to a little bit of the work that my buddy Sam McQuillan and I did. We were contacted by Friends of the Children. You may know of Friends of the Children. It's one of the few programs where mentors are paid a salary. And we were asked to help them, the friends, they call them friends, when they were mentoring older youth, adolescents, because they were finding that it was difficult sometimes to engage with older youth. They were less likely to be drawn to visit with the mentor. Okay. And they also were wondering about my work with peer engagement, how they can benefit from that. And so it raises the question, I think, of whether if you're trying to help kids that are on a trajectory toward problem behavior, delinquency, early pregnancy, school dropout, things like that, can mentors operate as agents of socialization, not unlike parents or teachers? So, from the point of view of adults, parents, teachers, and mentors, socialization is the process of helping youth participate in pro social contexts while limiting their involvement in contexts that promote problematic behavior. That should be fairly apparent. We're trying to guide youth toward good citizenship. Okay. However, next slide. From the point of view of youth, socialization operates differently. It's the process of finding and participating in contexts that offer greater and more reliable payoffs in other contexts. And here we have this young man being asked, Johnny, did you learn anything today? And he says, you betcha, as he's playing Grand Theft Auto. So some of you put in the chat earlier that feeling accepted, being wanted, might be part of what's happening. So that speaks to the idea that youth may gravitate toward peers and toward influences that meet a certain need. Okay. So what are the implications of these two views? Number one, and this is really important, youth are active players in their own development. The idea that socialization, parenting, and other adult influences is a simple top-down adult to youth process is not, it's sort of mythical. It's been way overstated, and modern scientific developmental research has certainly debunked that. There are a lot of other factors that influence youth development. And youth will invest in contexts that offer reliable payoffs and a sense of belonging. They will select and move toward contexts that do that. So pro-social contexts, home, school, mentoring, must recognize that there are competing with other contexts like delinquency-prone peers for youth time and attention. So that's I can't emphasize that point enough, that we compete for youth time and attention, especially when they become adolescents. And if any of you are parents and have had adolescents yet, then you kind of have a sense of what I mean. So it's not just are you responding to them in positive ways, but can you compete with other sources of influence? So pro-social contexts are neither randomly distributed nor equally accessible, because some youth cannot readily access a positive pro-social context, things like a sports team or a choir, but they might be able to access readily and easily problematic contexts. And some youth have limited success in pro-social contexts, such as school, but find success in problematic contexts, like hanging out with peers who smoke or drink. Thus, some youth will prefer to spend time, they will select delinquency promoting context. So this figure just speaks to that, what I just talked about, that there's differences in terms of the availability of pro-social versus more deviant contexts, and there'll be variability in whether youth can navigate pro-social versus more problem-involved contexts. And so what happens is, there's this competition, so to speak, in between the relative benefits of engaging in pro-social context, like school, or finding that, no, you're better off in this other context, hanging out, not going to school. Well, the other thing that can complicate matters is that youth who are poorly self-regulated, they will struggle to fit into and to succeed in pro-social relationships. Here's Calvin kind of losing it here. Next slide. So youth with poor self-regulation have less success in pro-social contexts. They have relatively greater success in contexts that promote delinquency, less access to future pro-social contexts, and less time to spend in future pro-social contexts. So if you believe in the influence of learning and the experiences of your youth, then you're having very different experiences that are shaping your outcomes if you are poorly self-regulated. And here's Calvin again. Pro-social contexts often require self-regulatory skills. And here's Calvin just trying to find a context that he fits in. It's not at home, not with the teacher, not with peers, not with academics. His mom's frustrated with him, and he says, the world isn't so bad if you can just get out in it. Find a place where you fit. So here we are where self-regulatory skills are moderating or interacting with with your access and success in these pro-social versus less pro-social contexts. Okay. Now, it's important to recognize, I'm basically giving you a primer on research on the development of problem behavior. So not all youth are at the same level of risk. Kids who are, and again, this was a study that we did with aggressive kids who are aggressive and difficult and defiant as toddlers or preschoolers are at mild to moderate risk. Those who are that same way or coercive and aggressive at school age, elementary, sometimes called early starters, they are at highest risk because they're starting early on a path toward delinquency. There are some kids who engage in delinquent behavior not until adolescence. Okay, those are actually at less risk. They're called late starters. Okay. So this is some compelling stats. Study done in '89. Kids who are identified as aggressive at age 8 or 9 have a 50% chance of being arrested by age 14. And of those who are arrested, 75% go on to have 3 or more arrests by age 18. So if you're working with children who have this developmental history, the stakes are high. So these are kids that are difficult to discipline and monitor. They're not well liked by their peers. Their teachers find them difficult. They tend to pull away from pro-social contexts. They tend to gravitate toward delinquency-prone peers. And once they engage with delinquency-prone peers, then that's when they start escalating their involvement in delinquency. Okay. So you can think about this as sort of a stairway leading down to problems, a cascade, if you will, a dynamic cascade of steps, beginning with an adverse environmental context, parenting that's not going well, poor school readiness, behavior problems that can lead to school failure. Parents find it difficult to supervise and monitor these kids, and then the gravitation toward more deviant peers. Okay. So this is a figure that depicts that. I think there's one more. Yes. So some youth go in the direction of sustained success in pro-social context. Some youth go in the direction, next slide, one more. Yes, a persistent antisocial behavior. So that in a way is our task. I mean, our task as mentoring folk is to try to help young people land with sustained success in pro-social context and avoid persistent antisocial behavior. But so much of it has to do with the context in which they can succeed and do well and are welcoming. Next slide. So I asked that question at the beginning because I thought most of you would think about peer associations as a source of influence. But I wanted to also let you know that there's a selection process, what a researcher named Tom DeShone referred to as shopping. Critical in the antisocial development process, he wrote, is the role of deviance in forming the glue of friendships. When deviance is functional for keeping a relationship together, it's kind of what you do. it remains a primary shopping strategy. The practice of coercion in the family undermines relationships and entrains response patterns that facilitate the emergence of antisocial behavior in other settings, such as schools and with teachers and peers. Eventually, children develop peer groups that encourage problem behavior and even plan and collude to commit antisocial acts. So, the simple point here is that you cannot ignore the influence of peers if you're working with youth that are at risk for later problem behavior. Okay? So, that brings us to this question. Can mentoring alter the process of shopping for quote unquote deviant friends? And this raises some key questions. Number one is mentoring a pro social context? And I'd like to believe that we can answer that with a resounding yes. A pro social context is one where the delinquent behavior is neither encouraged nor condoned. Hopefully, our mentors are not doing that. Pro social behavior is sufficiently rewarded. Hopefully, they're doing that. And delinquent behavior is reliably restricted. Hopefully, they're doing that. So, and I make the assumption, I think we all can, that screening and training is a way to ensure that mentoring is a pro-social context. But is mentoring a compelling context? Is mentoring a context that can compete if youth are willingly and repeatedly investing in time and energy into the mentor visits? Okay. That I mentioned that Friends of the Children asked us to help because they were having friends, their mentors struggle, some of them, with engaging with adolescent youth. That's not an uncommon phenomenon in youth mentoring. There was a study done, the role of risk study. I think Carla Herrera was one of the lead investigators on it. And there were a number of mentors who dropped out of mentoring because they perceived their young person as not wanting or needing a mentor and not really investing in the mentoring. And you probably have heard that story yourself if you are involved in a mentoring program. Mentoring is likely not competitive or compelling for youth if mentors struggle to schedule visits, if mentees are often reluctant to meet, if mentees withdraw from the program, if mentors lose interest in mentoring. Okay. So I'm not sure how this is landing on your ears, this notion that mentoring and mentors must compete for youth time and attention. I don't know if that sounds silly. I just think it's a bit presumptive to think that kids are waiting patiently for their mentor to show up and they have little else to do. And so you're coming along and sort of rescuing them from their isolation and their lack of opportunity to do other things. Thank you for that comment. So there's some recognition of how that can play out. So can mentors compete with other contexts? Mentors compete when visits are fun and engaging. So I'm a big brother. Well, I don't know if I can't say that I'm still a mentor with Big Brothers Big Sisters because my mentee is 22 years old. So he is definitely aged out. We're no longer having interactions that are under the auspices of Big Brothers Big Sisters. He still feels like my mentee, and I still feel like his mentor. And it's important. It was important for me to meet that first criterion, to have visits that were fun and engaging. Now, I worried about that a lot because when I first started mentoring him, as you can see, I'm an old guy. Well, I was pretty old when I started, so I was nervous about whether he would think I was fun. I joked about having my son on speed dial in case there was a question about a video game from him, because I wouldn't know how to answer that. But more importantly, with this first bullet of making visits fun and engaging, and this is true confessions here, that I sort of went outside the bounds of Big Brothers Big Sisters. Okay, and what I mean by that is that it was rare for me to have a visit with him that didn't involve one or two of his friends as well. So I'm just letting you know this is sort of my history here. We'll talk about the logistics and the problems with that, but just know that I have some personal history with mentoring in this peer engaged way. So mentors compete when not overly focused on achieving goals, teaching lessons, or correcting misbehavior. Mentors compete when visits involve enjoyable activities with pro-social peers. Peer engagement runs counter to mentoring that is cast strictly and narrowly as a one-on-one relationship. That last piece is important. I want to return to that in a minute. But just notice that the first three bullets speak to a lot of what happened with Lunch Buddy mentoring. We're competing with a social problem solving skills training, a highly trained community-based mentor, support for teachers and parents. Meanwhile, we had a mentor at the lunch table hanging out, not really trained, not really focused on achieving goals or correcting misbehavior, just having fun. And they did have a lot of fun. The mentors loved it and the kids loved it. And that outperformed the experimental condition. But what's being proposed here is heresy, right? I mean, who's going to do mentoring that's not one-on-one? Now, there are group models of mentoring, but I don't think we've fleshed that out adequately. We probably should have a discussion about what are people doing with their group mentoring program. But peer engagement runs counter to 100 years of mentoring that is done via a one-on-one relationship. So what might it look like if you or your program were to do something called peer engaged mentoring? Some youth who are mentored have friends that are relatively positive and pro-social. If that's the case, then your mentoring activities could routinely involve one or more of those friends, assuming you can work through the problems of, whatever the liability issues are with involving other kids. Mentoring activities that successfully engage the interest of these youth. So you're trying to find activities where you're building an interest among the youth and his or her friends. Mentors can be curious about peer norms, about peer beliefs, about peer behavior. You're tuned to the peer context in the course of your mentoring. You're recognizing that those are vital sources of influences. And of course, mentors can model for mentees and peers pro-social behavior and beliefs and create norms for that group that are positive and pro-social. But there are some youth who will be mentored who lack positive pro-social friends. And so it may require to actively seeking to connect mentees with pro-social peers and positive youth activities. So that's going to require a little bit more creativity. But let's go to the next slide. So what might be the options for safely accommodating peer engagement? Well, if you have pro-social friends, you can do a group mentoring program that deliberately recruits and enrolls youth who are currently friends. Imagine if you just kind of plucked those friends and brought them along. So you took this group and fostered a positive youth experience. Or traditional mentoring that you co-enroll an invited friend as a way to promote that peer engagement. Of course, you would need to train and support mentors in this approach to peer engaged mentoring. It's a different way to interact. A typical outing for me when I was mentoring would be I'd pick up my mentee and one or two of his friends, and we'd go get a hamburger, maybe go to a movie. And the conversation was always quite rich. You'd learn a lot about your mentee and about what they're up to when there's a whole car full of boys talking. So it would just really amplify the processes that can be beneficial for mentoring. For youth who lack pro-social friends, you might have to take an approach where group mentoring emphasizes a formation of new pro-social friendships. Or maybe a traditional mentoring in which mentors shepherd youth into and through positive youth activities, like you shepherd youth into a music organization or a scouts or an athletic team or something like that. So they have the opportunity to interact and engage in positive youth activities, but you are there by their side to increase the likelihood that they can succeed in that pro-social context. And of course, those mentors would also need support, training and support to do peer engaged mentoring. So this is a rather provocative set of notions. It's not detailed. It's not something that's in the can that's ready to be plug and play. It's meant to shift a little bit your thinking about how mentoring can work and how we might want to think about doing it. All right. Did I go too quickly there, Rachel?
No, you're okay, Tim. I think this will leave us a lot of time for a good discussion. Um, so I'll turn it over to you all. Please share what questions you have for Tim, either in our chat or our Q&A. We'll keep an eye on that. And since I'm off mute, I am selfishly happy to ask the first question, Tim. Since you were just
Sure.
talking about training for mentors, I'm wondering, um, what sorts of topics, what kinds of activities would you highly encourage programs interested in implementing this kind of, peer mentoring? What kind of things maybe get left out of traditional, like one-to-one mentor training that you feel like really needs to be heavily emphasized if folks are interested in implementing this kind of model?
I think the number one thing is the critical role that peers play in youth development. Um, when I first heard about Friends of the Children, which started in Oregon, where a lot of this research that I talked about was done, I assumed that if you're going to pay mentors to mentor a kid from grade 1 through grade 12, that you'd be attuned to what their peer affiliations were, because it just is so important. And yet it was not part of their model of change. And it's not part of, as far as I can tell, there's not many programs that incorporate that into the model of change. It's because we've had a century of one-on-one mentoring. In fact, one of the problems we have when we do school-based mentoring, lunch buddy mentoring here in Arkansas, where I live, is we have to educate school counselors and principals that when the mentor comes to the school and starts to mentor, it doesn't help us or the mentor or the child when you suggest that they go sit alone. We don't want that. We want them at the lunch table all together. And so right away, you're finding a model, a framework for thinking about mentoring as strictly one-on-one. So that's the first thing, okay? And right after that is recognizing to be smart and wise about whatever risk and liabilities come when you expand the network. So when you're doing lunch buddy mentoring, it's pretty low risk, okay? The thing you're doing is you're putting a mentor at a school, at a lunch table with other kids. So there's very little liability involved. You're not hurting those other kids by placing a mentor there. We find no evidence of that. In fact, we did a qualitative study where we interviewed the kids sitting at the lunch table with the mentee and the mentor, and they generally report that it's fun to have the mentor there. They want to have their own lunch buddy mentor. So that's a way to do it that's controlled and safe. If you try to do it outside in the community, then I think you're looking at some of these group mentoring models, quite honestly, that I'm less familiar with. I've not been involved in any of that. But that we might want to think about how we can be more intentional, particularly with boys, I think, with a group mentoring model. And I know that's often where group mentoring is done with boys.
Thank you, Tim. Not seeing any additional questions yet, but I'll just note some comments here. Lisa mentioned, yes, we compete. You have to keep mentees' attention. Absolutely. Programs that Lisa's been involved with as a mentee and a mentor, they do that through food, fun activities, relatable topics. You spoke to some of that, Tim. Are there other kind of key components that you would suggest and recommend for folks to make sure they are competing?
Here's an example from my own experience. And it, so, and this required some education, some learning on my part. So the young man that I mentor is biracial, identifies as Black, and it was not uncommon for him when he got in the car, we were driving somewhere, for him to take my phone and pull up a YouTube and start playing some rap music. And he had a real fondness for music that involved a lot of things like drugs and sex and bad language, and I was struggling with how to manage that. And I remember my colleague Renee Spencer. I asked her, I said, "What do you think, Renee? How should I respond because at first I thought I should be setting some limits around that, like a 3 F-bomb song. After the third F-bomb, we got to switch song. And she said, "Well, here's an approach. You could ask him why he likes the song." I said, "I love that. That's brilliant." And so one day we were in the car, and his buddy's in the back, and he's playing this song. And I asked him, I said, "So why do you like that song?" And he gives me a pretty this, pretty weak answer. I don't even remember what he said. And his buddy says, "I think you need another reason." So he was calling him out because he knew it was a pretty lame reason. Um, but I've since come to think that I erred in that, being concerned about that. I think it's because I was insisting without realizing it that he engage in a sort of code switching. That as a young person identifies as black, that's pretty somewhat discriminatory for me to insist that he listen to a certain music or not listen to the music he likes. And so I've come to view that as differently and from a broader lens, as I need to be open to him and not insist that he code switch and act what might be more in line with my culture and beliefs.
Thanks, Tim. No, we've got a comment from Amy in the chat. I like the lunchroom idea. The problem I've had with mentees choosing a friend to join them with their mentor is tricky. Mentees start being manipulative with this power and often get everyone upset, promising to take a friend, then changing their mind or asking for money or favors in order to get chosen. Does this come up at all in your work, Tim? What would you
That's
share with
interesting.
Amy?
Well, I love that comment, Amy, and it makes me wonder if that happens more with girls or boys, because girls tend to be more competitive in the relationship arena than boys. So more with girls, yeah. If I remember years ago, I had a patient, a mother brought in this young first grader, a girl, and she was having some trouble getting along with peers at school. And she was engaging in what's referred to as relational aggression. And so this little girl, she was quite clever. She formed a club, the cheerleader club, and she was, of course, the president. And she got to decide who was in the club and who wasn't, right? And so, if relationships are the thing that means the most to you, if you can control that, then you can see some manipulative behavior there. So boys tend to do that one. I didn't see much of that myself.
You'll have to let us know, Amy. You'll have to come up with a tactic and school the rest of us. So a few other questions for you, Tim. What if we don't?
Yeah,
Can you see
I,
those?
I,
We've got one
yeah.
about.
How do we keep mentors coming, but youth attendance is low? Kevin, I just love that question. I mean, most programs are not paying their mentors 100%. Yeah, so that's not the expectation at all. But it's a fair question of what's. I remember I've heard some mentors say I felt like I was stalking my mentee, trying to get him to hang out with me, and I could that makes sense to me because think about it, they've got stuff to do, they've got things that they're interested in, and mentoring may not be high on their list of priorities. When you're 9, hanging out with a mentor might be the coolest thing ever, particularly if you don't have the resources to do much that's fun. But you better bring a different set of strengths and assets to the mentoring game. And I'm suggesting that it's a win-win if you can do peer engaged mentoring, because on the first win is that you are a more compelling mentor. Okay, mentoring is itself more enjoyable, more compelling. It competes better. Secondly, you are engaging mentoring with a developmental arena that is just so pivotal, the peer association arena, and you're having an influence in something that is so very important. So it's a double win.
Thanks, Tim. A few other questions from David. David says, I love the additional context on the potential of involving peers and has seen it happen, especially with siblings and close friends being involved as well. What if you have competing contexts, mentoring versus peers? Instead of together, it's an either or situation. Is there a way to ease your way into both, or better to just settle and keep them separate?
Yeah, I noticed the mention of siblings. I will say that my mentee was one of five, and we never did any visits with his siblings. So that's a different developmental arena. And then I didn't never wanted the mentoring to compete, his mentoring experience to compete with having to share it with his siblings. But he never felt cheated at all when we brought his friends along. That was a plus. Um, and you may ask, well, what about opportunities to share important messages privately with him or things like that? These are opportunities to create norms with the people he trusts most in the world, his closest friends, around things like school, athletics, how do you treat women, the use of drugs, things like that. There are a lot of topics that could be floated and discussed when you're in the car, when you're just hanging out. So I didn't find that it was I had to choose between the peers and the mentee. And I don't know what more to say about that.
Thanks, Tim. We've got a lot more questions. Thank you. I'll keep them coming. Got a question from Nayela. What would be the best way to start a peer mentorship program among professionals? A little change of pace there, meaning what should be included in the training for mentees and mentors?
So professionals, meaning the mentors are professionals, and in what setting would they be mentoring, if I may ask that?
Yeah, chime in if you can clarify for us, Nayela. All it says is peer mentorship program among professionals. So I'm wondering if that is for in a social club. Okay, thank you.
So, okay. So is the question, what if you have a group of adults that are already peers that get along and then kind of direct them toward being mentors collectively? Is that what I'm understanding?
I'm wondering if this is a question about mentoring among adults as peers, but correct me if I'm not understanding your question, Nayela. Okay, yes, correct.
Correct to my conjecture or Rachel's conjecture?
Mentoring for adults, peer adults.
Mentors and mentees are adult. Oh, snap. Um, ooh, yeah. So, all right. I don't know what to say, but let me say this. I'm a professor. I have graduate students, and they have to do research theses and dissertations. And I have two graduate students who are in their first year. And the very first semester was last fall, and they're brand new. And to help them get their research started for their thesis, they were all in the same class. They had the same schedule. I met with them together for the first semester once a week. After the first semester, when their research needs diverge, I meet with them separately. So what I'm saying is that the needs were individualized to that point where the group mentoring was less helpful. When I supervise students who are learning to be therapists, we have group meetings where there's a collective sharing of information, but there's also a need for individual supervision. So it becomes more nuanced if you're talking about professional development.
Thanks, Tim. Next question. When do you think it's appropriate to bring in parents if the mentee has low engagement? Is that something that harms the mentee-mentor relationship, or have you seen it that it could increase it, working primarily with seniors in high school who are transitioning out into post-secondary pathways?
Wow, that's a big question. I love the question. So I have a bias on that. I think that we as mentoring people have done a not so great job engaging parents. We don't have a well articulated conceptual model for what is the role of parents. We don't usually ask parents what they're hoping to get out of mentoring. We ask them what their child's interests are and maybe who might be a good fit. Hang on, I got to switch.
Hope you can still hear me. But we don't do a good job of involving parents. For my mentee, I routinely would meet him at his house, go inside, meet with his mom. I got to know his mom. I actually did things like write her a letter of recommendation when she applied for a job. Helped get her a tire winner. She had a flat tire. So I wanted my mentee to see me interact with respectfully with his mother. Okay. But that's a pretty nuanced thing. I just don't think we've fleshed out well enough what mentoring with respect to the parents is like. Now, if you're asking me, what if can involving parents get their adolescent kids more involved in mentoring? I don't know about that. It sort of goes back to how I work as a therapist. If I have an adolescent patient, it's a tough call whether I'm working individually with the adolescent and engaging and bringing that person into the work, or whether it's more important to start with the family, and so the parents can state what their concerns are, and to find a suitable way to engage the young person because of the family being concerned. So it depends on what is motivating to the young person, being away from whatever parents want or having parents promote the engagement. I don't know. That's a great question, but I don't have ready answers for you. It kind of depends on what the youth, what the youth voice is. Do they want to be heard? Do they want to be engaged? Do they want to be left alone? Does mentoring make sense? Again, you're gonna compete, and you're competing with a lot of other forces.
Thank you, Tim. Next question from Autumn. Do you have any advice for implementing this with a mentor program who only works with foster children, as you don't want to single the kiddos out at school?
Only works with foster kids. I'm not sure what the second part is, because you don't want to single kids out at school.
Yeah, I think, and Autumn, jump in if I'm misunderstanding. I'm thinking if the youth in care are identified for the mentor, then folks will kind of know indirectly there'll be a disclosure if they're meeting with a mentor in front of other kids at school.
Okay, well, we have that with Lunch Buddy mentoring, because the mentors are sitting at the table, and it's not uncommon for kids to say, well, where'd you get a mentor? Who are you? Why are you his mentor? And we don't go into a lot of detail. We just say, well, I'm in a program called Lunch Buddy Mentoring. I'm his mentor, or I'm his friend. And that pretty much settles it. And once the fun starts, what we used to get the question all the time of, isn't having a mentor paired with a kid who's being bullied at school further stigmatizing that child? That could happen at middle school, maybe even beyond that. But in elementary school, it's a draw. The attention that mentor brings you, particularly a college-age mentor who has a certain amount of cachet, that's welcomed to the point where other kids want to have a mentor like that. We've never done Lunch Buddy mentoring in middle school. I think it might mean something very different, and I'm not ready to try that yet. In middle school, you don't want attention. You don't want to stand out. Often you want to be just fit in and kind of lie under the radar.
Thanks, Tim. We've got a question about, age and grades that might be helpful for this type of program. So Asta is wondering, we've been running a middle school lunchtime mentoring program and are looking at expanding into elementary school. What grade and age do you recommend starting with?
Good question. We typically do 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades. And I'm curious about how your middle school lunchtime mentoring program is going. That I'd love to know more about that, because we've been reluctant to try that. My wife is a middle school speech therapist, and a lot of her kids that she works with are on the autism spectrum. And she argues that mentoring at that grade level would be good for those kids because they're already recognized as somewhat different and distinct. And having a mentor there to be their sort of ambassador with peers might be really useful.
Thanks, Tim. Emily is wondering where we can read the research that you've done on this area of peer involvement. Are you able to share some key papers with the group who want to read more?
Glad to. That article by Julia Price is one you might want to ask for. There's also a paper, chapter that I wrote called Deconstructing Serendipity, which is a funky title. And it's a chapter that I wrote when we learned that Lunch Buddy mentoring, which was supposed to be a control condition, outperformed the experimental condition. And our response was, what the heck has just happened? And so it's our efforts to try to make sense of that. And there's other papers that I can share with you. So email me at the end. I think the last slide has my email address.
Yes, we'll share that. Everyone will get a follow-up email today. We'll make sure to highlight your contact info, Tim, and share the slides for today. Just a comment from Matthew. We have a peer mentoring program at my organization where former foster youth are mentoring current foster youth. I would recommend recruiting those former foster youth because the lived experience is a lot more impactful. Yeah, interesting follow-up to that question about serving youth in care.
Matthew, does that is that all one-on-one mentoring? Just the mentoring of foster youth is just so important, and I'm just wondering if any of that involves multiple youth or just always one-on-one. One-on-one and groups. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, you're a credible messenger, right? If you've been through that foster system. Huh. That's interesting. Melanie, if I'm saying your name right, do kids readily accept those invitations when they're invited to join those groups? Apparently so. That's awesome. Because it's made sort of special. Somebody must be running those groups right and making them fun, I bet. Super fun. Yes. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
Not that we're all biased as youth serving professionals that think SEL is super fun. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Awesome mentors. Absolutely. Thank you all so much for these great questions. I just want to pause and open up an opportunity for any additional questions for Tim here today.
I'm curious, can I ask a question?
Shoot.
So for those who may be involved in administering running programs, just how scary is it to hear that I was out there mentoring and bringing along my mentees' friends? And by the way, I routinely would clear that with their parents, but it wasn't like a formal Big Brothers Big Sisters document release form or anything like that. I'm just wondering, can you share with us some of your concerns on the risk liability side of things? I don't want to downplay that. My Big Brothers Big Sisters friends, their eyes would just sort of roll and they'd scoff when they heard about all the rules I would be breaking.
David is sharing, it's not uncommon from a programmatic point of view. From my previous role, I would encourage to keep it one-to-one and on occasion include peers.
And David, is there a procedure by which the mentors should follow for including peers? Any sort of formal procedure?
No formal procedure. It was often mentioned informally. Okay.
Yeah. That's what parents do. I mean, if I wanted to spend time with my boy when he was a teenager, I'd have to find a way to feed him and his buddies. Yeah. Yeah. I wasn't breaking a rule with my own mentee. No, he'd love that. But that's great if you can create a program that just is from the get-go is designed to be peer engaged, and you take care to get those parental releases and permissions.
Yeah, and comment from Matthew, we sometimes get siblings more than peers, but as long as the caregiver is giving consent and you are background cleared.
Yeah. Again, based on my research as a psychologist, I wouldn't do siblings. It's a different dynamic. Very different. And that's based on no research. It's just based on my knowledge of the research on sibling dynamics, sibling peer relationships, the frequency of conflict, and the idea that how much of a perk is it to spend time with you if they have to bring their sibling along? You know, does it detract from that? So that's what I would be mindful of.
Some notes here from David, just being sure the loop in staff, obviously, if we're involving peers, in addition to caregivers. Great note, David.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. But in my experience, and I don't want to be throwing shade on big brothers, big sisters, but there wasn't a lot of oversight of what I was doing. I was, I'd get a call maybe 3 times a year, talk about 15 minutes. Y'all still seeing each other? Yeah. Everything going okay? Yeah. It wouldn't be a whole lot more than that. It wasn't a lot of accounting or curiosity about what we were doing.
Good food for thought there for checking in with your mentors regularly, Tim. Free tip that.
Checking in with my program.
Yes. Well,
But shouldn't it go the other way? I mean, I'm spending time with my mentee
no,
regularly.
staff, yes, staff checking in with their mentors. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jessica noting standards are a little bit more strict these days. Yes.
In our school-based lunchtime mentoring program, we use an online log system. So after every visit, mentors have to go online and record the fact that they had the visit, and then rate about 8 items in terms of the quality of the interaction with you and the child, you and the lunchtime peers, and various things like that. So we have a record after every visit. We know we're closely monitoring the mentor visits. Is there a system like that being used somewhere? Surely there is. Where mentors log their visits? Yeah, Amy says yes. Good to know. I never had to do that as a big brother, but I haven't been in the formal association as a mentor for 4 years.
Any final questions or feedback for Tim? Tim, any questions for our group?
Well, I guess I'm wondering, is this maybe a fair question? Is any of this helpful or different, or is it old news and not that helpful? Because I painted the picture at the beginning that this is somewhat heretical and different, but you may be saying, no, we're already doing this already.
Very helpful, lots of exclamation mark, Tim. I think you've got a lot.
Well, again, I was mainly looking to see if it's being done routinely, what I'm calling peer engaged mentoring, then it's important not only for me to know about that, but for the field to know about it, because then that represents maybe a significant shift in how we think about mentoring. Yeah, thanks, David. Amy, our mentors, our Lunch Buddy mentors meet one-on-one at the beginning of the semester to get to know for an introductory meeting, and at the end of the semester to say goodbye. That's when we do the one-on-one. So it is a mix, like you're saying.
And then we have an ask here from Wen, maybe Tim and others in the group, if you can share. We ask mentors to fill out a short Google form that includes amount of time and focus of support, what they're doing when they're spending time together. Can you share the other questions you ask on your mentor logs?
Yeah.
What are folks asking?
Yeah, I don't know if I can dig that up right now, but I can share it with Rachel. Maybe you can distribute it.
Happy to do that.
Okay. Glad to do that, Wen. Wow, you guys have been great. Super engaged.
Any last questions for Tim? Just thanks for Renee. Thank you, Renee. Amy, I completely concur that those relationships based on fun tend to be the ones that last and the most effective. Absolutely.
Yeah, and if I may piggyback on that, think about that from a training standpoint. That if you can lead with fun and engagement, then you're doing good work. And there's a parallel, by the way, in the psychotherapy field. So one of the tensions or debates in psychotherapy is who's the hero of the work? Who's doing the work? Are the benefits because of what the therapist is doing, or is it because of what the patient is doing? And there's some pretty compelling research that shows that patients are doing most of the work, not only in session, but certainly between sessions. And if that's the case, then it means that the job of the therapist is to have an engaging experience. You don't want it to be a boring, non-engaging experience. Then therapy is not doing its job. And I think it very much relates to mentoring. If you can't have an engaging experience for your youth, they're not going to want to, you won't have any influence. They won't learn anything from you. For me, my expectation was, can I get a win of him wanting to do the next visit? That to me was my aim. I wasn't striving for some great transformation in his development. I just wanted to have enough fun and engagement that he would say, what are we doing next week? And I would celebrate that. And the other thing is to just show up. And so I think we've sometimes oversold the goals of mentoring. And I would trim it down, show up, and be fun and engaging. And if you can do that, that takes care of 90% of what we want.
Yes, great words to end on, Tim. I appreciate that. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. If we don't have any questions, we'll end our webinar today. You all will get a follow-up email that will include resources, some of those papers that Tim mentioned, a copy of the slide deck. You'll also have a very short eval that I hope you all will just take a few minutes to complete. Just let us know how this was for you. And keep your eye out for more info on our next webinar. Thank you all again for taking time out. And thank you so much to Tim for sharing with us today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.